Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And to those of you who are online, we welcome you as well. We're gathered in the Mathematics Auditorium on the Macon campus. And this gathering is part of what is called by the university system Ethics Awareness Week. I'm very grateful for the work that our ethics awareness coordinators have done in staging a number of activities this week. And I confess, I need to do the training because I didn't know how to answer one of the questions in the test quiz. I thought, there's two answers to that I could put down, and one of them is wrong. So I'm going to go and do the training. But we are very grateful that you gathered, and I would also, I won't steal Jenia's thunder by introducing the panel. I saw that Jenia's doing that, but I want to say to all of you, thank you for what you do in your work to help foster an awareness of our responsibilities and our excellence and professionalism. And I will give a welcome to our USG colleague, Traci Stromie, who's come down from the university system to be part of this. So thank you for joining us, Traci. But I won't introduce them because Jenia's doing that. What I will say as president is that there's a danger in having specific focus events that's like, oh, that week we did that, and then we get back to doing the rest of our lives and our work. Ethical life and ethical work is not an event. It's an attitude, a disposition, and a set of behaviors that are endemic to the successful running of a university. Put simply, as well as the individual responsibilities we have. It's very easy to think that ethics is a personal thing. And yes, it certainly is, but it's also very much a public commitment. When we talk about public higher education, the key often is we go to higher education, we don't think of the word public and the implication of public. I'm fond of the phrase the common good, but recently have reframed that the public good. Because the word public implies a relationship between people. You're not in the public if you're isolated, if you're standing alone, if you're not engaged. And the word good speaks to what is the purpose of public. It's about trying to elevate. It's about a value system of what we would term as good. And Ethics Awareness Week is about that commitment to the public good, but it doesn't stop on Friday. It's actually at the very core of what a public university should be doing, is understanding our relationships, understanding when they are good and healthy and strong, and understanding when they are weak or endangered or dysfunctional. And the commitment to move along that spectrum towards the good. And I hope this week is something that continues to remind us that not on Friday when you finish, you didn't check off ethics awareness, that when we come back on Monday, how can we continue to foster an environment where our commitment and involvement in the public good is literally an opportunity every moment of every day. And I would say it's a responsibility that we as educators have, because to me there's no disconnect between education and goodness. We are in the development business of bringing out the best in people. And that's something that everyone in this room and everyone online is, the reason you get up in the morning and come to work is because you're part of that story, part of that public story of this university. So I thank you for being here. It's going to be a great panel. I am thrilled that I wish I was here for all of it, but I'm thrilled that I'm not, because I actually have to go and teach a class. And believe me, when a president does that, it's the really good part of the day. Maybe not for the students, but for me it'll be a good experience. With that, thank you each and every one of you up here for sharing your work, your ideas, your thoughts, your lives with the audience. Please ask them questions. We need dialogue around this stuff, and I commend all of us to remember every day what we can do to help strengthen the public good. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jenia Bacote. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and also the Title IX Coordinator for Middle Georgia State University, one university with 5 campuses. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists to you in just a bit. Once I do introductions, we're going to move into general questions, which will be available for anyone on the panel to answer. And then I will move into specific questions for each of our panelists. First on our panel is Dr. David Jenks, our Provost. Dr. David Jenks is our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. He leads the Office of Academic Affairs. He leads the university's faculty, oversees the development and implementation of new academic initiatives, and preserves continuity and advancement of existing programs. Dr. Jenks received his PhD in Criminology and Criminal Justice from Florida State University and his master's in Criminal Justice from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Next, we have Dr. Andre Nicholson, who is an associate professor of media and communication in the Department of Media, Culture, and the Arts, where he teaches courses in public relations and news writing. Before he became a professor, Dr. Nicholson served 21 years in the United States Air Force, where he worked in the installation's public affairs office. After his retirement, Professor Nicholson attended Howard University in Washington, D.C., where he earned a PhD in mass communication and media studies. His research interests include examining the representation of African American men and women in the media, the strategic use of social media, and media ownership. He has published work on non-objective news reporting in local, national, and entertainment news, and is currently waiting publication of a co-edited book about the works of Issa Rae. Dr. Nicholson recently earned the 2022 Faculty Award for Excellence in Service and was awarded MGA's first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Faculty Award in 2021. Next, we have Ms. Traci Stromie. She's a Leadership and Institutional Development Manager for the University System of Georgia. Her coaching and professional development offerings focus on leadership development, flourishing, which is doing well and being well, productivity, building community, emotional intelligence, and engaging in the online space. Traci designs and facilitates sessions and programs for both system office employees and faculty, staff, and administrators across the USG. She is an associate certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, earned her Master of Science in Instructional Design and Technology from Georgia State University, and a Bachelor of Science in Social Science Education from the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. Prior to joining the system office, Traci served as a faculty developer, faculty success coach, and senior instructional designer at the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Kennesaw State University for almost 12 years. And next, we have our very own Chief Tripp Mitchell, who serves Middle Georgia State as the Chief of Police and Executive Director of Public Safety over all of our campuses. His background in law enforcement spans 30 years. His educational background includes a master's degree in public administration from Columbus State University, as well as a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Mercer University. He is a graduate of the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development Program and the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police Executive Training course. He holds the designation of Certified Protection Professional. He is a state certified trainer and has served as adjunct criminal justice faculty at various colleges and technical schools, as well as an instructor at many regional police academies. And last, and certainly not least, Modupe Oyewole, our SGA president. She hails from Lagos, Nigeria. She is a senior currently majoring in information technology with a concentration in cybersecurity, an active member in the MGA community. In addition to the SGA presidency, she is also a residential assistant on the Macon campus. Please give our panelists a warm welcome. So today we have a lot to discuss, and I promise you there will be a Q&A session beginning at 10:45. And for those online, please submit your questions to the online chat, and we will read as many of those as we can. Okay, we're going to get started with our general questions, which means anyone can be brave and answer the first question here, and others can jump in. As we think about this term ethics, how do you define ethics?
Yeah, we all look towards the academic when it comes to defining a term. I like that. Ethics is, generally, a set of values, a set of moral principles that, we live by on a regular basis. Pam already warned me, don't go into the academic definitions of the social contract. But in a lot of ways, that's where ethics lies. It's relatively straightforward, but also incredibly complex. If you think about, a consensus perspective, most people agree on things most of the time, and therefore ethical behavior follows that trend line. But we also have a conflict perspective where most people don't agree about most things most of the time, and then ethics can actually vary. When you come into those difficult types of situations with how to define ethics, the easiest solutions are in textbooks that we're all familiar with, like Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Treat other people like you wish to be treated. Be civil, be moral, be kind, and ethics kind of falls in line with that.
I'll just follow up on that a little bit. Excuse me. I do think that Dr. Jenks mentioned ethics and moral. I think we kind of interchange those terms a little bit. So I would say that ethics is more so a systematic set of standards that we should follow, where morals is more of an individual system that we follow.
Okay, make a great point. Does anyone else want to offer your wisdom on?
Hello. Okay. I would say ethics is the principles that the society follows, like I guess the standards and the guidelines for the society to follow.
A great point. And Dr. Nicholson, you kind of segued already into my second question. Is there a difference between ethics and morals?
Yep. In my opinion, there is, because, as I mentioned just a second ago, ethics is, in my opinion, a set of standards or codes or guides that should give us direction as an institution or a system. And when we don't have that in place, it kind of leaves the individual to follow their own morals and ethics. So I think it's very important that as an institution or system, we should have a set of standards or ethics that we go by and follow. Because if not, that lends us as individuals to go by our own morals and ethics.
Sure, I'll say one of the things I look at it is from a perspective of what we do in our scope of practice is that when we think about ethics, we think more of a culture rather than just taking a course in ethics. And I think when you're dealing with ethics and morals, morals is a societal norm in which people agree on one area, but ethics is really about following that moral compass, choosing to follow that moral compass when you know what's right and you know what's wrong.
Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think morals come into play and are developed by our cultural experiences. They can be really individual. They're developed as we grow and as we get normalized into society. But ethics are really helpful as we're looking at policies, guidelines at institutions and systems where we have a place where we can say, here are our ethical values, and here's where we're really going to hold those boundaries together for ourselves and for others.
Okay, great points. So now you can talk to me about what are the most common ethical issues that you confront in your field of expertise? And please leave names out.
I'll start. One of the things we look at from the police department is equitable enforcement of the law. to ensure that we're ensuring the due process and the constitutional rights of others. We're trained in the police academy, we're trained to do certain things, but one of the things we always want to ensure is all our officers are doing the right thing for the right reason. So even though we should not face ethical issues, one of the problems we have is critical incidents. Critical incidents are unscripted. These are things that are not taught in a police academy per se. We know that they come up, and we have to be very proactive with our integrity because we have to train them, and we have to practice, and we have to know that the responding officers are going to do the right thing, because you can make a lot of rules. You can write policies and procedures. We have a policy and procedure manual for our standard operating procedures. However, an organization cannot really dictate every circumstance. They can't write a rule for everything. So what we want to do is make sure that we are putting our ethical dilemmas out there with issue identification first of what could come up, and then rehearse our defense of how we're going to respond and how we're going to apply these ethical standards to those situations.
Awesome. You make a very crucial point about the similarities between ethics and integrity. That it's about, are you going to do the right thing when no one's watching? Does anybody else want to weigh in on this?
Sure, I will. There are so many different issues within the Division of Academic Affairs and at the university in general that we deal with on a regular basis. But one of the most common, and one that we need to focus on because it's something that we teach, is ethical behavior in the classroom. And that's both faculty and students. And, it's always interesting when you start talking about, plagiarism and things like that with students who are writing research papers. And Dr. Nicholson and I were talking about this right before we got started. In academic research, as a student, everything has to be relatively unique and individual and new content that they create on their own. However, you have to cite all the academic research that you use to build that knowledge so you can actually contribute something significantly to the body of knowledge that exists, which is great when you're trying to explain it to students, but they're reading your own articles, and your articles are basically a culmination of everybody else's research cited out. And it's like, so if an academic and their faculty member who's teaching the class does something, and puts all it together and submits it as an article, it's research. But if a student does the same thing and has too many citations, it's not original content. It really doesn't, match what you need for the class. So it's kind of an inherent contradiction, and trying to explain that to students that, taking someone else's work and claiming it as your own is not necessarily, ethical or moral, or, depending on their perspective. You still have to teach them the difference between the two. So dealing with issues like that, where you say, it's not really ethical to take somebody else's work and, claim it as your own, and then they're like, but didn't you do that when you published your last article? So it's fascinating to deal with those types of issues, because you really get into the nuance of, what's acceptable and what's not, and it actually contributes to the learning environment for students. But sometimes those nuances are lost when, you've got 5 classes, and you might get different information from different faculty members at different times, and following those principles within an academic field, and they vary by field sometimes. So it's always interesting to look at things like that.
An interesting point. So the ethical culture is ingrained in academic affairs. Dr. Nicholson, did you want to weigh in on that?
I did, actually. So as a faculty member, one of the things we are responsible with doing is serving on search committees. And the one thing I see quite often on search committees is people who will pad or puff their resume or CV. So padding their resume is when they're actually including information that's false, and puffing their resume is kind of just using creative writing to kind of exaggerate their accomplishments. So you do see that quite a bit, and you have to be able to identify that. And serving on about 15 or 20 search committees over the years, I've seen that. So that's an issue. Another thing I would say I've seen as a faculty member, and this kind of give me a side eye from my other colleagues, I feel, is when a faculty member who reaches the promotion and level of professor who is tenured, they seem to withdraw a little bit from the university activities. And I've often had many conversations with other faculty members about how do we deal with that as junior faculty members, because now the workload is put more on us, because those people have kind of withdrawn themselves from participating and engaging in the university. Some people will look at that as a rite of passage. You know, once you attain this level of promotion, you afford some level of rest and not having to do as much, right? So I don't know. That's a conversation I've had with quite a few people. And is it right or wrong? Is that something that faculty members who've obtained this level of accomplishment, should they still be held accountable and be expected to do some of the work that we're doing as junior faculty members?
Yes.
Thank you.
Stromie?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I think some of the challenges that I see in my work doing leadership development with individuals at all levels of organization is the idea of values identification. What are their own values? How do they operationalize those values? How do those align with the values of the institution and the system office to help really figure out what is that compass when they get into these situations of identifying what is the issue, where does their integrity lie, what is the right thing to do. And then also another part of my role is doing this coaching for faculty and staff and some of the challenges I see individual leaders face at different levels. And one thing that comes up consistently is this idea of transparency, and we want transparency from our leaders. We want to know as much as they can give us, but individuals in leadership positions know there are certain amounts of information that can be shared at different times. And so I think figuring out what is that balance of transparency, how does that lead to trust, is really critical, and I see come up in a lot of coaching conversations.
That's a great point. Okay, so now we're going to move to the more interesting, intriguing part of this panel discussion, the specific questions for each panelist. I'm going to skip around a little bit, and I'm going to give our USG panelists first here. As a leader, what are the characteristics of ethical leadership, and how do you develop these characteristics, and why is ethical leadership important?
Yeah, I think that if you look at a lot of the research out there, if you look at the models, a lot of the frameworks, you see a lot of different characteristics, but there is a lot of overlap. And so I think looking at our own USG leadership competency model is a really helpful place to start, as well as our USG ethics policy, which has a foundation of personal integrity and ethics, and then kind of breaks that down even further into specific behaviors and competencies, looking at respect. How do we respect individuals? How do we treat them fairly, equitably? How do we have accountability? I know one of your college values is stewardship, and thinking about how do we have accountability, how are we good stewards of our money, our time, our resources, our people, and really thinking about what that looks like as a leadership characteristic. Also excellence, and then respect and integrity, I think, are critical. And as I mentioned before, ethics are really important to build that foundation of trust. Oftentimes when we think of ethics and being an ethical leader, it might be, well, let's not lie on our expense report. Let's not take, more time or more resources than we actually need to do the job. But really, it's about building those relationships with people, doing the right thing, understanding them, and being able to communicate in a way that is transparent to the best that we can.
Make a great point. It's about leaders modeling ethical behavior that they expect from their staff as well. So thank you for that. Chief Mitchell, have you encountered any ethical dilemmas in your professional career, and does ethics apply to everyone?
I'm going to answer the second part of that first. And yes, ethics does apply to everyone. No one is immune from that. Over 30 years of law enforcement, yes, you're going to face ethical dilemmas. One of the areas that we face on most ethical dilemmas is balancing officer discretion with ethical decision making. Because if we take one stand on the end of the spectrum where we say we're going to have a zero tolerance for crime, we wind up over-policing and putting ourselves in a position in which we're not being equitable. We're not taking into consideration big picture thinking. But on the other hand, other end of the spectrum is if we don't do anything, we put ourselves in a position to look weak, or we don't look as though we're trying to do something to better the security and the safety of our campus environments. Also, you know, we talk about little ethical things. It can be the big things. I sometimes think police departments, we try to do it right. We don't always get it right, but we try to do it right. We wake up every day saying, this is what we want to do right. And we do mess up, but we talk about transparency. I'm one of those individuals that I confess my sin pretty quickly. I want to get ahead of it to say, hey, this was not right. We didn't do this right, because I want that ethical integrity. I want to be proactive with it. I think police legitimacy is very important and having police ethics is part of that legitimacy. The community needs to see that we're trying, and we're trying hard.
Great point. You're speaking on the intentionality of being ethical. And Modupe, so glad to have you here. How do you deal with the ethical challenge when your values do not align to the perceived norm or are in opposition to those of your peers or even your professors?
Okay, thank you. I will speak to my peers.
Good choice.
So, yes. So, as a student leader among my peers, they can tend to have a certain perception or they can think, oh, I should act or react a certain way because I guess we're friends or, you know, we're students. But I have to remember that, okay, I cannot let what they think or how they perceive, how they want me to act or react to a certain situation, because first and foremost, like most importantly, I'm a student leader and I have certain obligations to follow. So I have to take myself out of the situation and think, okay, as a student leader, as your president, how should you react in this situation? I have to try to be unbiased and try to say, okay, I guess put my SGA president cap on and say, okay, you have to react in this situation, although your friends might not like it, although sometimes I might not like it, but it's something I have to do based on my position. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's a great point that you're making also, that in this culture of ethics, it involves a level of self-awareness as well. Dr. Nicholson, should an institution such as ours have an established set of ethical standards that are separate or distinct from our core values?
Yes. And I think that our core values, our 4 core values, as you see behind us, are our vision and our motivation that's going to guide us as an institution. But I think a separate set of ethical standards and codes should be created, and everyone should know where those are and how to find those and how to communicate those in order for us not to lend ourselves to individual beliefs and practices. So there should be an ethical code established outside of our core values, so we as individuals know what the institution's policies are and guides are, so we can then carry forward those core values.
That's a great point as well. While we do have our core values, sometimes you have to tell people what it is that you're telling them. So we have to have a separate section that says ethical behavior, just in case they can't infer it from our core values. Dr. Jenks, last but not least, of course, how do we promote and facilitate a university culture of ethics? What advice would you give faculty, staff, or students when faced with an ethical decision?
That's a great question. I think we touched on a lot of the answers to that in the previous questions. You know, modeling is clearly something that, you know, we have to live by on a daily basis in all situations. And then also understanding, you know, that you have to have full transparency in these things. Understanding that, you know, ethics is not necessarily, you know, black and white, and there's some line that you cross and all of a sudden you're unethical. And it varies by situation and time and place. You know, a simple example, I'll use it because, you know, Chief Mitchell is sitting here. if we look at the speed limit, there's an absolute demarcation of what's legal and what's not. But if you're 1 mile an hour over, there is nobody that's going to try and enforce that and say, okay, you're being unethical, you're breaking the law. It's the same situation we have in academic affairs at the university in daily interactions. There are those, demarcations where, they're clearly unethical and clearly ethical, but there's a huge section of gray in the middle. And a lot of times, I think, as academic leaders, as leaders in higher education, we have to model the behavior that gray exists and understand that we need to talk with others about particular situations and say, I don't know the answer to this. Because a lot of times people will come and say, I need a decision. And it's like, okay, I'm going to need the details. I'm going to need a lot of details, and I'm going to need 3 people, and we're going to need to meet, and we're going to need to discuss this at length and figure out exactly, what the best avenue to proceed so that everyone involved, it feels heard, feels, included, and actually, gets a result that seems fair, and at least, it may not always be the result you want, but it's the result that you've modeled from a behavior of ethical decision-making and ethical behavior on a group level, that involves everyone you can get into a situation. So if I had to, provide advice, I would say think this through. A great advice for any time you're dealing with a situation, unless it's absolutely necessary. If you're in a critical incident, you don't have, a night to sleep on it, but sleep on it. Talk to the people you know, talk to the people you trust, talk to your mentors, talk to other leaders, get perspectives from outside, our own institution, outside your own culture. The culture of the institution is the culture of the institution, but that's not the culture of every institution. It's not necessarily what's going on in higher ed or in society. With 5 institutions, 5 campuses across 180 square miles, the culture of Macon Bibb is not the culture of Dodge Eastman. You have to take those things into consideration when you're wading around in that gray, and that's where we spend a lot of our time.
Very valid point. Life is full of gray, not always black and white, but you bring out a great point about the importance of collaboration when you're in that gray space and talking to others and getting other people's opinions, other levels of wisdom, in order to make a good judgment call on what you should do.
Yeah, and I think one point that I would add to that is you also have to be willing, and I think a couple of folks touched on it, you also have to be willing to be held accountable. We are not going to make the right decision all the time. Every now and then, doubling down and saying, I'm just moving forward with this because by God I made the decision and that's the way we're moving, is not always the right thing to do. It's obviously not always the ethical thing to do. You've got to be able to say, mea culpa, my mistake, let's pivot, you were all right, I was all wrong, let's go forward. And in those situations, it falls back to, ethics and morals. At points, you have to be fully willing to put others before self. Because, some things that are, the self-serving situation where you say, I made a decision and I'm going to stick by it and, I'm absolutely certain it was right, is not really the ethical route, nor the moral route.
Not at all. Welcome to leadership. Okay, I think we have time for going back to one general question. Why is it important to even have an Ethics Awareness Week or a discussion about ethics? Just to wrap this up, why do you think it's important, this week is important?
I'll just keep talking because this is fun. President Blake touched on this. It's not something that you want to touch on and go, okay, I'm done with ethics. I've got 51 weeks of living again. I'm going to move on. But it's also something that we need to do from time to time to remind us, of some of the values that we live by and some of the things that we have to focus on that we don't necessarily. I mean, no one would say, Middle Georgia State University an ethical place, and then people would be like, I don't know, we never really talked about that, never thought about it. Ethics doesn't play a role at Middle Georgia State University. It does. It's part of all of our daily interactions. It's part of our daily life. It's part of civility and just how we deal with other people in meetings, in passing, in standing in line at Starbucks to get coffee in the morning. All of those things, play a role in a lot of ways, but we don't really focus on them, and think it through. And one of the things that's, incredibly important in leadership at any time is reflection, and being able to focus on it in a way that's meaningful, and we can look back on it and really do an assessment of how well we're doing or how well we're not. And getting, a whole bunch of experts up here and saying, I'm willing to talk about this is interesting, because it opens, that dialogue, not just for this week, but also for weeks down the road, and it may come up next March. Somebody will walk up, to the SGA president and say, hey, I saw you on the ethics panel. I've got a problem. How do I fix it? And it just provides the opportunity for more dialogue. So it's always good to focus on things like this that are important but embedded.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. If anybody signed into the Chancellor's ethics conversation on Monday, he talked about every week is Ethics Week, and we're just spotlighting it now. So along the same lines as the president, thinking about, we might tend to overestimate our responses or reactions or how we're going to handle specific situations unless we spend the time to be self-reflective, to think about what our reaction is going to be, what are our values in different situations. And having these conversations about hypotheticals is important, although we're not going to cover every circumstance, but thinking about generally how might we approach things is really critical to being able to respond appropriately when those situations do arise.
Chief, do you want to?
I think that what we look at from the perspective of just chiming in on both what my colleagues up here on the stage have said is that when we get into these roles of a spotlight, one of the things we do is we see other people and our other colleagues in the room, and we know that we have a group of people that want to be ethical. The people that show up for the meetings, the people that go online, the people that take proactive steps to say, I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna take time out to do that. It may give you an opportunity, like SGA being a mentor to someone, being able to say, hey, let me run this through you. I think it's so important to be able to have someone you can communicate and say, I need to run this by you. I find in my own experiences, we can sometimes get in a silo, for example. And I find myself in your office asking questions. I find myself, in my other colleagues' offices just saying, let me run this by you outside of the law enforcement perspective. What do you think from just a management perspective? What would be the right decision? I know with HR, we have those issues as well. I just want to get perspective. And these weeks and these spotlights give us the ability to find other people within our peer groups and our executive staff to the opportunity to really speak about that and to really find who that mentor or who that colleague would be that we can trust and confide in.
Modupe?
Yes. I would say it helps to remind us why, as a society, we should act a certain way or and why. So we're able to understand, okay, so I have to do this because of this, because, it's wrong or it's right. And sometimes we might forget, we might think, okay, we might get used to doing something, but it might not be ethical. And when we have like a week like this, we're able to remind ourselves like, okay, so I should probably stop doing this, and, I should probably do it this way. So I think it helps remind us about the good things.
Dr. Nicholson?
Yeah, I'll just add too. So one thing I always like to make sure, particularly like in my classes, is when the semester is over, is that students have something tangible to walk away with. So when we finish out this week, do we have something tangible other than our discussion that we can walk away with? Is great, but for instance, do we have policies in place at each institution that are ethical standards or codes that we can follow, particularly for things like employee social media posts, like what's right or wrong when it comes to that, or email messages, what's right or wrong when it comes to that, right? It's not a problem until it becomes a problem. So if we don't have those standards in place.
That's a great point. But I will add that our wonderful marketing communications department can help you and all of us with our social media content and emails as well. Before we wrap up, we realize that there may be some faculty and students who need to leave for the 11 o'clock classes. And we're going to transition to our Q&A portion from the audience at this time. So if you will raise your hand if you have a question for any or all of our panelists. Ms. Booker has a microphone, and Rose has one.
This question is for Dr. Nicholson. So one of the things that we continue to read about is the military is one of the most trusted areas, institutions in America, across America. You having been retired military, do you see a difference in how the military supports and drives ethical culture and organizations outside of the military promoting ethical culture?
A good question, Cheryl, and I do actually, because being in the military, the one thing I can say is the military was very clear on their ethical practices and behaviors and standards and codes of conduct. I mean, it was written, it was clear what was right or wrong. Working as a civilian and not necessarily here, but jobs before this, they were not so clear. And so I think the military does a little better, and again, it has been 10 years since I've been retired, so who knows what's happened. It was a little easier to understand and know what the ethical standards and expected practices were in the military.
Is there another question?
This is open to anyone up there. Have any of you individually, or maybe you just know a student or faculty or staff, run into a situation where someone's strong individual moral compass was at odds with the laid out ethics of the institution?
Chime in again. I haven't run into it where it's been an issue with their morals and ethics against an institution, but more so about my beliefs in the classroom and what we were discussing. So I've had students who obviously don't believe the same way you believe, and in the classroom, my job is not to make you believe a certain way, but just to open your mind up to different ways of thinking. And this student in particular was not willing to do that, right? So they were challenging on every issue, every topic we came across. And I think I would share this story with someone just the other day, but in particular, one of the discussions we had was about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. And we were talking about the media and how the media sometimes portrays certain groups of people as being lazy or not working as hard, and if they just work harder, they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And so this particular student was saying how her father was a farm owner, and he was taking care of his farm, and he had become very successful, by selling his stock and doing certain things. And so my point to her was, well, how did your father obtain this farm? And come to find out, it was passed down to him by his father, right? So yeah, you worked hard once you got it, but did you have to work hard to get it? And some people don't have the luxury of having something handed down to them to get to the point where you are. So I was just trying to get her to understand that point.
I probably can, I thought of something along that lines as far as just the classroom perspective, but it involved the law enforcement perspective. About 6 months ago, I believe it was the Dublin campus, we had a class going on, and as you know, we have a no weapons policy in the university inside the classroom, and a student wanted to talk about his career and what his background was going to be, and they were told to bring a prop. And he was in farming, and he wanted to bring a pitchfork. And he walked right into the Dublin campus with a pitchfork. And so, even though that may be a tight rule that says no weapon policy, this is an identity for this student. This is who this student is. This is their culture. This is their background. This was not unethical. This was not immoral. And in their eyes, why would it be illegal? It's a tool of the trade. If I brought a stethoscope in for my career. So that's where we look at it and say, if we're going to be hardline and not have that gray area, what we need to be able to do is say, what's right in this circumstances? I don't know that we can please everyone, but I do know that we can stand up and work towards, a community engagement where we're doing the right thing for the right reason.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and chime in. Yes. We had a situation, different institution, many, many years ago with a faculty member who was one religion student who was another faculty member assigned the test on the day, no excuses. This is the test day where everybody has to be here. Student, this is a holy day, it's reflective. And that issue was brought to my office, and there was an immediate opportunity for me to learn a whole lot about finding experts, discussing with the system office. That's a system office question, absolutely. We'll forward that in a heartbeat, trying to find some kind of mediated result. And it was an incredibly difficult situation, and we were trying to find the ethical balance between the two, and realistically, they were never going to agree. It was one of those situations where we had to find accommodations for the student without offending the faculty member. So yes, you see those things from time to time. They're very case specific, but they will arise.
Do we have any questions from our online audience?
Yes. What are some of the resources that faculty, students, and staff have for handling challenging ethical issues that you want to make sure we know about, or perhaps we don't know about?
Well, I do know that we have an ethics hotline that is an ability to do it. We have a great internal auditor as well that we work with on that staff, and I'm privileged to be part of that as far as learning how the institutions and the university system and the system office really view a lot of those ethical things. So that's a great resource. I know that we've have areas on our websites that you can reach out through our links to be able to get the additional training that we need. We work through it for the police department ourselves through independent training that we do. But as far as faculty and staff, I think there's a lot of, through human resources, I know that they have offered several areas of training annually and some opportunities there as well. And I think your first step is, if it's a faculty or staff member, it should be your supervisor. That should be your first resource. And if your supervisor doesn't know, that's a problem. But that should be your first source. And if it's your student, it should be your instructor, your advisor, your coordinators and Title IX coordinators and diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinators, someone. We have resources available.
Yeah, I would add to that. I would just say, yes, absolutely, your supervisor should always be a resource for those types of things. There are resources at, in HR, at the system office, statewide. We've got a whole lot of different things that people can reach out through online, but sometimes you want that face-to-face conversation, and I think feeling free to discuss it with anyone at the university that's in a leadership capacity is something that if we don't have the answer, we'll find it. And we can direct people to those resources that they need in their specific situations. And I'll go ahead and just throw all of us up here on the stage under the bus and say, if you can't figure out who you want to talk to, or if you've got a problem at any point, feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can absolutely direct you to where you need to be.
Yeah, and I'll just add from a system office perspective, we do have some great web resources on our ethics website with the policy, additional responses to expand on some of the policy language. If there's something specific that individual might be looking for there, there's also an ethics hotline phone number and reporting form if somebody does suspect something unethical happening.
Is there another question from online? Okay. Any further questions from our in-person audience? No. All right. I think we're done. No questions?
Is there somebody, can the panel ask a question? Because
Do we want to?
I can. I got a nod.
I got a nod from
can ask a
HR.
You got a
question.
mic, so.
I've got a
Yeah.
mic, so I guess I get to ask a question. I'd be interesting to hear what everyone else thinks, and especially our SGA president. How are we doing? We can use this as a point of assessment. How are we doing in modeling ethical behavior, leadership, and passing that along to students as they pass through their curriculum?
I will speak from a student's point of view. I would say, as MG, an institution, we are doing pretty good. We have like, we have events. I know 2 weeks ago, we had the Diversity and Inclusion seminar here on the Macon campus, and I was privileged to attend that. So I know we have the resources, and we're able to promote and I guess teach people from our professors, guiding us in the classroom to like outside the classroom, that we have like student leaders and our supervisors are like our peers also. So I think MG is doing really good spreading the ethical, I guess, culture. Yes.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, as we wrap this up, first of all, let's give our panelists a nice welcome and thank you. We've had a rather robust conversation today, I think. But as we conclude, I ask each of you in the audience and virtually to ask yourself, is being ethical a choice? And I think the panelists here have kind of answered that question to say, yes, it's a choice that we can make. At MGA, we do embrace an ethical culture. Think about our core values that are up here on the stage: stewardship, engagement, adaptability, and learning. Each of these values can only be effectively demonstrated in a culture that promotes ethical astuteness. Each of us has a role to play in ensuring we operate transparently and with ethics. And your participation in attendance today demonstrates that you believe ethics is important. And we thank you for attending.